In a world where your worth is measured by the beast inside you, what happens when you have nothing to offer but your own blood? Serathis Vale learned the answer the night her uncle dragged her before a king who devours weakness for sport. They called her broken. Wolfless. A stain on the bloodline. But when you've got nothing left to lose, you stop asking for mercy and start taking what's yours. Stick around till the end of this story, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments so I know where my pack is watching from. Because what happens next? It's going to change everything you thought you knew about power. The throne room stank of wet stone and old blood. Serathis Vale stood in chains at the center of it, bare feet against marble so cold it burned. The iron cuffs bit into her wrists, cutting shallow grooves into skin already marked by years of similar restraints. She didn't pull against them. Pulling only made it worse. She'd learned that the hard way, back when she still believed struggling might change something. Above her, the vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadow thick enough to drown in. Torches lined the walls in iron sconces, their flames throwing jagged light across the faces of those who'd come to watch. And they were all watching. Every alpha in the Iron Fang Dominion had gathered for this, the presentation of tribute to King Malric Veyron, supreme ruler of the 6 territories, the man who'd unified the packs under a single brutal fist and crushed anyone who questioned his right to do it. Sarathus could feel their eyes on her skin like insects crawling, burrowing, looking for the soft parts to bite into. Her uncle stood to her right, 10 feet away, but might as well have been on another continent for all the connection between them. High Alpha Draven Kor, leader of the Iron Fang pack. The man who'd raised her after her parents died in a border skirmish she'd never gotten the full story about. The man who'd spent 23 years trying to find a use for the niece who came into this world wrong and stayed that way. Tonight, he'd finally succeeded. You couldn't see the king from where Sarathus stood. The throne sat elevated on a dais of black granite, carved from a single piece of stone hauled up from quarries 3 territories away. The figure on it was backlit by hanging braziers that turned him into a silhouette, all shoulders and shadow, and the promise of violence held in check by nothing but his own decision to hold it. But you could feel him. The air in the room bent around his presence the way it bent around a coming storm. Even the flames seemed to lean toward him, like they recognized something in him that was kin to their own nature. Draven's voice cut through the silence, loud, performative, the voice of a man who needed everyone in the room to hear him, to witness his loyalty, to remember that he was the one who brought this offering. We come before you, King Malric, bearing tribute as custom demands. Gold from our mines, refined and pure. Steel from our forges, tempered in blood and fire. Pelts from the winter hunts, and... He paused. Let the pause stretch out until the silence itself became a kind of pressure, something rare. Sarathus felt the shift in the room, curiosity sharpening into something uglier, hungrier. The kind of attention that preceded either entertainment or bloodshed, and most of the alphas in this room didn't particularly care which. She kept her eyes down, kept breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way you breathe when you're trying not to break, when you're holding yourself together with nothing but will and the muscle memory of survival. The king's voice came from the throne, low, textured like gravel under a boot heel, like the sound a mountain might make if it decided to speak. Rare. Just the one word. But it landed like a stone into still water, and the ripples went out through every soul in that room, through every heartbeat, and held breath. Draven smiled. Sarathus couldn't see it, but she knew the shape of it. The one he wore when he was about to do something cruel and call it strategy, when he was about to hurt someone and frame it as necessity. Yes, my king, a curiosity. A remnant of old bloodlines, though whether blessing or curse, the texts do not agree. He gestured toward her with the casual dismissiveness you'd use to point out a piece of furniture. This is Serathis Vale, daughter of my late brother, may his spirit run eternal. Born under a full moon as tradition dictates, born to alpha blood on both sides, raised in the old ways, but cursed by fate itself. Another pause. He was good at pauses, had turned them into an art form. She bears no wolf. The room erupted. Not in sound. Sound would have been cleaner, would have had a shape you could brace against. This was a wave of contempt that moved through the gathered alphas like disease, like poison in the bloodstream. Sarathus felt it crash over her, felt the way their disgust curdled the air, made it harder to breathe. Wolfless. The word got passed around, whispered from mouth to mouth, spit out like something foul. Someone laughed, a short, vicious bark of amusement that cut through the murmuring like a knife. Draven continued as if he couldn't hear them, as if this wasn't exactly the reaction he'd orchestrated, the humiliation he'd planned down to the last detail. She cannot shift, cannot hunt, cannot bond, cannot produce viable offspring. By every measure of our people, by every law and custom we hold sacred, she is nothing, an empty vessel, a body without the soul that makes us what we are. He let that word hang there. Nothing. Let it settle over her like ash. And yet, Serathis looked up. Not at her uncle. She'd stopped looking to him for anything years ago. At the throne. The king was leaning forward now. She could see the outline of him, the sheer mass. Massive shoulders built for carrying the weight of an empire. Arms that could break bones like kindling. A stillness that didn't feel human, that felt like standing in front of a predator deciding whether you were worth the effort of killing. And yet, Draven said, his voice taking on the tone of a merchant selling something exotic, something dangerous. She is of Vale blood, ancient lineage, pure back 7 generations. There are texts, old texts, hidden in the archives of the fallen kingdoms that speak of her kind, powers that do not require the wolf, abilities that predate the shift itself, gifts that manifest in other ways, lies. Sarathus almost laughed. Almost. Because that's what this was. A story Draven had invented to make his offering seem less pathetic, less like he was dumping his broken niece at the feet of the most powerful man alive and hoping for the best. To turn her from something disposable into something exotic, something worth the king's attention. The king's voice came again, closer this time. He'd stood. She could hear the scrape of stone against metal, the sound of his boots on the granite steps. You bring me a wolfless girl and call it tribute. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement that came before an execution, before someone's head separated from their shoulders and their body became a warning to others. Draven didn't flinch, didn't step back. He was too arrogant for that, too convinced of his own cleverness. I bring you a mystery, my king. A test. A gamble, if you will. If she is truly powerless, then she is yours to do with as you please. Discard her, kill her, use her however you see fit. But if the old texts are correct, if there is something dormant within her, something waiting to be awakened, then she is mine to awaken, the king finished. His voice had gone flat, cold, the kind of cold that preceded frostbite. Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. Coming down from the throne, each step measured and unhurried because he had all the time in the world, and everyone in this room knew it. Serathis watched his boots appear at the edge of her vision. Black leather. Reinforced with steel at the toe and heel, the kind of boots built for crushing bone, for walking through blood and ash and the broken bodies of anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. Look at me. She didn't move. Couldn't. Because looking up meant acknowledging this was real, meant facing whatever was about to happen. The command came again, quieter this time, which somehow made it worse. Look at me. Serathis raised her head. The first thing she saw was the scar. It ran from his left temple down across his face, bisecting his cheek, disappearing into a beard kept short and maintained with the same brutal efficiency he applied to everything else. The second thing was his eyes. Dark, not brown, something deeper, something that didn't reflect light so much as consume it. The third thing was the way he looked at her. Not with disgust, not with pity, with calculation. King Malric Veyron was a man built like a natural disaster. 6.5 feet of muscle and controlled violence, shoulders that could carry the weight of nations, hands that had personally ended more lives than most soldiers saw in a career. His jaw was carved from stone. His presence filled the room the way water fills a cup, completely, inevitably, drowning out everything else. He caught her chin, tilted her face up with fingers calloused from decades of gripping sword hilts and throats. His grip was iron, unyielding. What's your name? Not a question. An order, the kind you didn't refuse unless you wanted to find out what happened to people who refused him. Serathis. Her voice came out steady. That surprised her. Surprised him too, judging by the way his eyes narrowed slightly. Serathis Vale, she added. Because if she was going to die here, she'd die with her full name spoken. The king's eyes moved over her face, reading it, cataloging every detail. The hollow of her cheeks, the shadows under her eyes, the scar on her lip from where one of Draven's guards had backhanded her 3 years ago for speaking out of turn. You're afraid. She didn't answer, didn't see the point in stating the obvious. Good, he said. You should be. He released her chin, turned to Draven, and the temperature in the room seemed to rise slightly, like the pressure had eased just enough to breathe again. Make her dance. Serathis felt the floor drop out from under her. My king, I don't... Draven's voice had lost some of its certainty, some of that smooth confidence. You heard me. You claim she has power. Some dormant gift. Some ability the old texts speak of. Prove it. Make her dance. But she has no training. No... Then it should be interesting. The king's voice carried an edge now. The kind that said he was done with explanations, done with excuses, and very close to being done with Draven himself. There was no music, no preparation, no moment to gather herself, just the sudden, horrible understanding that this was the test. This was the moment Draven had orchestrated, and she was the instrument he'd chosen to play, the pawn he'd pushed forward without regard for what happened to her after. Her uncle stepped toward her, leaned in close enough that only she could hear, close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath and the rot underneath it. Don't embarrass me. His voice was a hiss, a threat wrapped in desperation. A guard stepped forward, one of the king's men, not Iron Fang, and unlocked her chains. They fell away with a clatter against the marble that echoed through the vast space. Sarathus stood there, free and more trapped than she'd ever been, alone in the center of a room full of predators. The room was silent now, waiting, hungry, every eye fixed on her, every breath held. She looked at the king. He'd stepped back several paces, arms crossed over his chest, expression unreadable, waiting to see what she'd do, whether she'd crumble, whether she'd run, whether she'd prove to be exactly as worthless as she appeared. Dance, he said again. And something inside Serathis, something she'd kept locked down for 23 years, something she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten it existed, broke open. Not with a snap, not with violence, with a slow, deliberate unfurling. Because here's the thing about being nothing your entire life, about being told every single day that you're broken and wrong and a disappointment. You learn how to survive in the cracks. You learn how to move through a world that doesn't see you, doesn't want you, doesn't have a place for you. You learn how to make yourself small, invisible. You learn how to disappear even when you're standing right in front of someone. But invisibility is just another kind of power, and Sarathus had spent 2 decades perfecting it. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and began to move. Not like a trained dancer, not like entertainment, not like someone performing for an audience. She moved like water finding its way through stone, like something inevitable and patient and utterly without mercy. Slow, controlled. Her bare feet made no sound against the marble, her steps leaving no trace. Her arms rose, not gracefully in the way court dancers moved, but with a kind of raw honesty that cut through the performative violence of the room like a blade. There was no music, so she became her own rhythm, her own melody, the sound of her breathing, the whisper of her worn dress against her skin, the pulse of blood in her veins. This wasn't a dance. This was a confession. Every motion carried the weight of every humiliation she'd ever endured, every rejection, every moment she'd been told she wasn't enough, would never be enough, could never be anything but a burden and a shame. Every night she'd gone to bed hungry because she didn't deserve the same portions as the real pack members. Every morning she'd woken up to find new bruises she didn't remember getting. She spun, not fast, controlled. Her hair, long and dark and tangled because no one had cared enough to give her anything to tie it back with, whipped around her face. She dropped low, almost to the ground, knees bent, spine curving, then rose again with a fluidity that seemed impossible given how thin she was, how malnourished, how broken. The room began to shift. She could feel it happening. The way the air changed, the way the temperature dropped, the way the alphas who'd been sneering and laughing moments before went quiet, went still, their contempt giving way to something else. Confusion. Unease. Because what Sarathus was doing, what her body was saying in a language older than words, wasn't entertainment. It was defiance. It was survival made visible. It was every ounce of will she'd ever had to summon just to keep breathing, just to keep existing in a world that wanted her dead or gone or at least invisible. She extended her arms, and it looked like she was reaching for something, or maybe pushing something away. She arched her back, and it looked like either surrender or challenge, depending on how you looked at it. She moved faster now, her feet finding patterns on the floor, her body creating shapes in the air that had no names but somehow made perfect sense. And the shadows in the room. The shadows were moving. Not the normal movement of shadows when the flames flickered. This was different, purposeful. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to pulse in time with her movements, to breathe when she breathed, to respond to something she was doing without meaning to do it. Serathis didn't notice. She was too far inside herself now, too deep in the movement to see what was happening around her. But the king noticed. King Malric Veyron stood utterly still, every muscle locked, his arms still crossed but his hands now gripping his own biceps hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. His jaw was clenched. His eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that bordered on violence, like he was trying to see through her, into her, to understand what the hell was happening. Because something was happening, something he hadn't expected. His breathing had changed, slowed. The tight lines around his eyes had eased. The tension in his shoulders, the permanent tension that came from carrying a curse that was eating him alive from the inside, had loosened. For the first time in 7 years, the pressure behind his eyes had stopped building. For the first time in 7 years, the thing inside him had gone quiet. Serathis pushed further, moved faster, let her body speak the language it had been practicing in silence all these years, the language of surviving without permission, without approval, without anything but the stubborn refusal to stop existing just because existence was hard. She leaped, not high. She didn't have the strength for that, but there was something in the motion that transcended the physical limitations of her body, something that made it look like she weighed nothing at all. The shadows pulsed again, darker this time, deeper. And the king stumbled. It was barely noticeable, just a slight shift in his stance, a minute adjustment to his balance. But for a man who stood like he was carved from the earth itself, like nothing could move him unless he chose to be moved, it was monumental. Draven saw it. His eyes went wide, his mouth opening slightly. This wasn't what he'd expected. This wasn't part of the plan. He'd brought Sarathus here to be humiliated, to be rejected, to prove his loyalty by offering up the most worthless thing he owned. He hadn't expected her to do anything. Certainly hadn't expected this. "My king, are you—" Silence. The word came from Malric like a whip crack, sharp enough to draw blood. He hadn't taken his eyes off Serathis. Couldn't. Because if he looked away, if he broke whatever this connection was, the pressure would come back. The curse would remember it was supposed to be killing him. Serathis was breathing hard now. Sweat ran down her spine, soaked through the thin fabric of her dress. Her legs were shaking. Her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because for the first time in her life, she was being seen, not as broken, not as worthless, not as nothing, as something else entirely, as something dangerous. The realization hit her like cold water. She could feel it in the way the room had gone silent, in the way the king was staring at her, in the way Draven had taken a step back, his expression cycling between pride and fear and something that looked almost like regret. She was dangerous, not because she had a wolf, not because she had power in the traditional sense, but because she had survived everything they'd done to her and she was still here, still moving, still refusing to disappear. And that stubborn, unreasonable refusal to break was its own kind of power. The dance ended the way it began, with a slow, deliberate stillness. Sarathus stood in the center of the throne room, chest heaving, arms at her sides, sweat dripping from her chin to splash on the marble. Her legs were trembling so badly she wasn't sure how much longer she could stay upright. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The flames and the torches burned straight and still, like even they were holding their breath. King Malric took a step toward her, then another. He moved like a predator stalking prey, each step measured and controlled. But there was something else in the way he moved now, something almost cautious. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, rough like he hadn't used it in a while. What are you? Not who. What? Like she was a thing to be identified, categorized, understood. Serathis met his gaze, held it even though every instinct screamed at her to look away, to lower her eyes, to submit. I don't know. The truth of it hung between them, raw, honest, the first honest thing anyone had said in this room all night. The king reached out, not for her chin this time, for her wrist. He took it in his hand, gentle, almost careful, and turned her arm over, exposing the pale underside, the blue tracery of veins beneath skin that had never seen enough sun. His thumb pressed against her pulse point. She felt him go still, utterly still. His eyes went distant, unfocused, like he was listening to something only he could hear. Then he dropped her arm like it had burned him, stepped back, turned to Draven, and when he spoke, his voice had gone cold, flat. The voice of a man stating facts that couldn't be argued with. I'm keeping her. Draven's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise. Calculation. Something that might have been concern flickering across his features before he schooled them back to neutral. My king, you honor us with your acceptance of, this isn't honor, Malric cut him off. This is necessity. The girl stays. You take your tribute and go. But surely, my king, if I could be of assistance in understanding what... No. The word fell like an axe. You've delivered what you came to deliver. Now leave. Draven's smile flickered, just at the edges, just enough to show the calculation happening behind his eyes, the wheels turning, the plans reformulating. Of course, my king. She is yours to command. I ask only that you remember the generosity of the Iron Fang pack when... Get out! Draven's mouth snapped shut. He bowed, low, the kind of bow that looked like respect but carried an undercurrent of resentment sharp enough to cut. As you command. He turned, started toward the massive doors at the far end of the throne room. His boots clicked against the marble with each step, echoing in the silence. Then he stopped, looked back, not at the king, at Sarathus. The expression on his face made her blood freeze in her veins. Because it wasn't anger, wasn't the contempt she'd grown up with, wasn't even disappointment. It was recognition. He saw what she was becoming. He saw the danger, and she could read it in his eyes as clearly as if he'd spoken the words out loud. He was already planning how to destroy it. Draven left. The other alphas followed in his wake, filing out in order of rank, their footsteps creating a rhythm like a funeral march. The massive doors swung shut behind them with a boom that reverberated through the stone. The throne room was empty now except for Serathis, the king, and the guards who lined the walls like statues. So still they might as well have been carved from the same stone as the building itself. Malric was studying her again, that same intense focus he'd had while she danced, but different now. More controlled, like he'd had time to think, to process, to decide what she was to him. Do you know why I took you? Sarathis shook her head, didn't trust her voice yet, because when you moved, he stopped. Reconsidered his words with the care of a man who didn't often explain himself. I have a condition, a curse, if you believe in such things. It's been with me since I took the throne, since I unified the territories under one rule. It grows stronger every year, every month, every day. He paused. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter, something he didn't want to swallow but couldn't spit out. It's killed 3 healers who tried to cure it, 2 shamans who swore they could bind it, and a blood mage who claimed he could cure anything as long as the price was paid. I paid. He died anyway. Sarathis waited. Her heart was still hammering but slower now, more controlled. When you danced, the king said slowly, carefully, like he was testing each word before he spoke it, it stopped. The words landed like stones dropped into deep water. For the first time in 7 years, I felt nothing. No pain, no pressure, no thing inside me trying to claw its way out. Just, he paused. Silence. He said it like the word itself was sacred, like silence was something he'd been searching for through conquest and bloodshed and the systematic destruction of anyone who stood in his way. Sarathis' mind was racing, spinning through possibilities and impossibilities. This didn't make sense. She had no power, no wolf, no magic. She was nothing. Everyone had told her so. For her entire life, every authority figure, every pack member, every person who'd ever looked at her. "I don't understand," she said. "Neither do I." The honesty in his voice surprised her. The king turned away from her, walked back toward his throne with slow, measured steps. He didn't sit, just stood there, one hand on the armrest, staring at the empty room like he could see through the walls to something beyond. "You'll stay here, in the capital, in my keep. You'll be given quarters, food, whatever you need within reason." It wasn't an offer, it was a statement of fact. Every night you'll be summoned. Every night you'll dance, for as long as it works, for as long as the curse stays quiet. "And if I refuse?" He looked back at her over his shoulder. The expression on his face was almost pitying. Then the curse returns. And when it does, it doesn't stop at me. It spreads. To the guards, to the servants, to anyone within the walls of this place. I've seen it happen. I've watched good men tear themselves apart because they were standing too close when it broke free. He let that sink in. Let her understand exactly what he was saying. So, no. You won't refuse because you're not the kind of person who lets innocent people die when you could have stopped it. How do you know what kind of person I am? Because you're still alive. The words hit harder than a fist. If you were weak, truly weak, you would have died years ago. Your uncle would have seen to that. But you're here. You survived him. Survived being nothing in a world where being nothing is worse than being dead. He turned fully to face her now. That takes a kind of strength most people never have to learn. The kind you can't fake. The kind that either breaks you or forges you into something harder than steel. Sarathus stared at him. At this king who ruled through fear and violence, who'd crushed nations and walked through rivers of blood to build his empire. And he was calling her strong. A guard stepped forward. Female, tall, scarred across the throat with a wound that looked old, healed badly. The kind of injury that should have killed her. "Take her to the eastern wing," the king said without looking at the guard. "Third floor. The room with the barred windows. Make sure she has water, food, clean clothes." He paused. "Windows that lock from the outside." The guard nodded once, sharp, efficient. As Sarathus was led away, her arm held gently but firmly by the scarred guard, she glanced back once. King Malric was watching her, still hadn't moved, still hadn't looked away. And for just a moment, so brief she almost missed it, she saw something flicker across his face. Not gratitude, not relief. Fear. He was afraid of her, or afraid of what she might become. The realization followed her all the way through the winding corridors of the keep, up 3 flights of stairs worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, down a hallway lined with doors that all looked the same. The guard stopped at the last door, unlocked it with a key from a ring at her belt. The room beyond was larger than the shed Serathis had lived in back at the Iron Fang compound. That wasn't saying much. It had a bed, an actual bed with a frame and a mattress and blankets that looked clean, a window with iron bars set into the stone, a basin for washing, a small table, a chair. The door locked from the outside, just as the king had specified. The guard gestured for her to enter. Sarathis stepped inside. The floor was cold stone, but someone had put down a rug. Threadbare, faded, but a rug nonetheless. "There's a chamber pot under the bed," the guard said. Her voice was rough, damaged, like the scar on her throat had gone deeper than the skin. "Someone will bring food in an hour. Water's in the basin. It's clean." She started to close the door. "Wait." The guard paused, didn't turn around, didn't look at her. "What's your name?" A long silence, long enough that Serathis thought she wouldn't answer. "Kael. Why are you helping me?" "I'm not." The door closed. The lock turned with a solid click that echoed in the small space. Sarathus stood in the center of the room and waited for her hands to stop shaking. They didn't. Because the performance was over now. The adrenaline that had carried her through the dance was draining out of her system, leaving behind something cold and sharp-edged and hollow. She'd survived. But survival wasn't victory, it was just postponement. She walked to the window. The bars were solid, well-maintained. She gripped one and pulled. It didn't budge. Of course it didn't. These weren't decorative. These were designed to hold people who could shift into wolves, who had strength beyond human. They'd hold her just fine. Beyond the bars, she could see the city. The obsidian capital of the empire spread out below like a maze of stone and shadow. Lights flickered in windows, smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere down there, people were living their lives, eating dinner, putting children to bed, fighting, loving, existing in the normal world. Sarathus had never been part of that world. She'd always been adjacent to it, a ghost at the edges, something that existed in the spaces between things. But now she was something else. She didn't know what yet, but she was going to find out. The door opened again. No knock. Just opened. Kael stepped in carrying a tray. Bread that looked fresh, cheese, something that might have been dried meat, an apple, a cup of water. She set the tray on the table without a word. Serathis stared at the food. Her stomach was a knot of tension and hunger twisted together so tight she couldn't tell which was which. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. Yesterday? The day before? You're wondering if it's poisoned, Kael said. It wasn't a question. Serathis met her eyes. Held them. Is it? No. Why not? Because the king wants you alive. Kael turned to leave. Wait. The guard stopped. Still didn't turn around. The scar on your throat. How did you get it? None of your business. Did someone try to kill you? Yes. Why? Because I refused an order. Serathis processed that, looked at the tray of food, at the locked door, at the barred window. And yet you're still here. Kael's shoulders moved. Might have been a shrug, might have been something else. So are you. She left. The door locked behind her. Serathis stood there for another moment, then walked to the table, picked up the bread, tore off a piece, looked at it, put it in her mouth. It tasted like survival, like tomorrow, like the first step toward something she couldn't name yet, but could feel building inside her with every breath. She ate everything on the tray. Then she sat by the window and watched the moon rise over the obsidian capital of the empire, and she thought about kings and curses and the way power worked in a world that had tried so hard to convince her she had none. And she smiled, just a little, just enough, because they'd made a mistake, all of them. They'd assumed that being powerless meant being harmless, but the most dangerous people in the world are the ones who've already lost everything, because they've got nothing left to fear. And Serathis Vale had been nothing her entire life. Now she was going to find out what nothing could become when it stopped asking permission to exist. They summoned her the next night. No warning, no explanation, just the sound of the lock turning and Kael standing in the doorway as the sun bled out across the horizon, turning the sky the color of old wounds. It's time. Sarathus had been sitting by the window, watching the city wake up to darkness. She'd spent the day learning the rhythms of this place, the way the guards changed shifts, the way servants moved through the corridors carrying trays and linens and buckets of water, the way sound traveled through stone. She stood. Her legs were still sore from last night's performance, but she didn't let it show. Kael led her down through the same corridors, down the same stairs. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them had a texture to it, like fabric worn thin from use. The throne room was different tonight, smaller somehow, though the dimensions hadn't changed. The king had dismissed most of the guards. Only 2 remained, stationed at the doors like bookends. The torches burned lower, casting longer shadows. King Malric sat on his throne, but he wasn't lounging. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together, waiting. When he saw her, something in his posture shifted, relaxed slightly, like a man who'd been holding his breath and finally remembered he could let it out. That should have made Serathis feel powerful. Instead, it made her feel trapped, because she understood what it meant. He needed her, and need was just another kind of chain. Dance. No preamble, no explanation, just the command. Serathis moved to the center of the room. The marble was cold under her bare feet. Someone had given her clean clothes, a simple dress, rough fabric, but clean. It moved easier than the rags she'd worn yesterday. She closed her eyes, found the stillness inside herself. The place she'd learned to retreat to when Draven's guards got too rough, when the pack hunts left her behind, when the world reminded her she didn't belong anywhere. And she began. The movement came easier tonight, like her body remembered the language it had spoken yesterday and was eager to speak it again. She moved through the silence, creating shapes that had no names but carried meaning anyway. The shadows responded faster this time. She could feel them gathering at the edges of the room, pressing against the light from the torches. Not threatening, just present, like they recognized her, like they'd been waiting. The king's breathing slowed, evened out. His shoulders dropped. The lines around his eyes, lines carved by pain and pressure and years of carrying something too heavy to name, began to smooth. Serathis opened her eyes mid-movement and caught him watching her, not with lust, not with the kind of hunger she'd learned to recognize in the eyes of men who thought women were things to be consumed, with something closer to desperation. She filed that information away, kept dancing. When she finished, the silence that followed felt different than yesterday. Less shocked, more expectant. The king stood, walked down from the throne, stopped a few feet away from her. It worked again. His voice carried a note of relief so profound it almost sounded like grief. Sarathus met his eyes, held them. "What exactly is it doing to you?" The question seemed to surprise him, like he wasn't used to being asked direct questions, like his authority was so absolute that people had stopped treating him like someone who could be questioned. "You want to know." "Yes." "Why?" "Because if I'm going to be your cure, I should understand the disease." The logic was sound. But that wasn't why she'd asked. She'd asked because knowledge was the only weapon she had, and she needed to understand what she was dealing with. The king studied her for a long moment. Then he turned, gestured for her to follow. "Come." Kael moved to intercept, but Malric raised a hand. "Leave us." "My king, protocol." "I said leave." Kael hesitated, just for a second. Then she bowed and walked out, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. The other guards followed without being told. The doors closed. Serathis was alone with the most powerful man in 6 territories, in a room designed for public displays of dominance, and no one was coming to save her if this went wrong. Good thing she'd stopped expecting to be saved years ago. The king walked to the far wall where a tapestry hung. He pulled it aside, revealing a door she hadn't noticed before. Small. Unremarkable. The kind of door you'd use if you didn't want people to know where you were going. He opened it, gestured for her to enter. Serathis looked at the darkness beyond the door. Looked at him. "If you're going to kill me, at least do it somewhere with better lighting." The corner of his mouth twitched. Might have been the ghost of a smile. "If I wanted you dead, you'd already be dead." Fair point. She walked through the door. The passage beyond was narrow, lit by torches set into the walls at intervals. Stone stairs spiraling downward. The air got colder as they descended, heavier, like they were walking into the earth itself. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere no one else knows about." "That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be." They descended for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. The stairs ended in a chamber carved from raw stone. No decoration, no furniture. Just stone walls and a floor and a ceiling and a single torch burning in a sconce. And in the center of the room, a circle, carved into the floor. Deep grooves filled with something dark that might have been dried blood or might have been something worse. The king walked to the edge of the circle, stopped. "This is where it happens." His voice had gone flat, empty. What happens?" "Where I lose control." He turned to face her. "The curse isn't constant. It builds, like pressure behind a dam. Most days I can hold it, keep it contained, but every few weeks it breaks through. And when it does," he gestured to the circle, "I come down here, alone, lock myself in, and I let it out." Serathis looked at the circle, at the grooves, at the stains on the stone floor that no amount of scrubbing would ever remove. "What does it look like? When it breaks through?" "You want details." "I want to understand." Malric was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, like he was choosing each word with the precision of a man defusing a bomb. "It starts with the pain, behind my eyes, in my skull, like something trying to crack me open from the inside. Then the shadows come. Not metaphorical shadows, real ones. They pour out of me like smoke, like I'm burning from the inside out." He paused. "They consume everything they touch. Stone, metal, flesh. They don't discriminate. That's why I come down here, where there's nothing to destroy but stone and my own body." How long does it last? Hours, sometimes longer. When it's over, I wake up in that circle, covered in blood, usually my own. Sometimes I'm not sure. And no one's been able to stop it? Serathis asked the question carefully, watching his face. Everyone who's tried is dead. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was reciting a grocery list. But when you dance, it stops. The pressure eases, the pain recedes. For the first time in 7 years, I can think clearly, can breathe without feeling like I'm drowning. He looked at her. So yes, you're my cure, whether you want to be or not. And if I stop dancing, then people die, starting with me, ending with anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby when the curse breaks loose. Sarathus processed that, looked at the circle, at the king, at the way he stood just outside the carved grooves, like he was afraid to step inside even now. Here's what she understood. This man had conquered nations, had unified territories that had been at war for generations, had built an empire through violence and will and the systematic destruction of anyone who opposed him, and he was being eaten alive by something he couldn't fight. That had to be maddening. She filed that away too. Why are you showing me this? Because you asked, and because... He stopped. Started again. Because you're the only person in 7 years who's treated me like someone who could be questioned. Everyone else either fears me too much, or respects me too much, or wants something from me too much to ask direct questions. So you're lonely. The words came out before she could stop them. The king's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Lonely implies I want companionship. I don't. I want competence, honesty, someone who'll tell me the truth instead of what they think I want to hear. He stepped closer. You don't fear me. You should, but you don't. I do fear you. Serathis kept her voice level. I'm just practiced at functioning while afraid. That got another ghost of a smile. We should go back, before someone notices we're gone and assumes the worst. What would the worst be? That I've killed you, that the curse has broken free, that the empire is about to tear itself apart. He started toward the stairs. In that order? Malric glanced back. Does it matter? I suppose not. They climbed back up in silence. The air got warmer as they ascended, lighter. By the time they reached the hidden door behind the tapestry, Sarathus could breathe normally again. The throne room was empty. The guards had remained outside. Kael will take you back to your room. Same time tomorrow night. The king's voice had returned to its usual tone. Commanding, absolute. What if tomorrow night isn't enough? Then we'll find out together. He walked back to his throne. Sat. Looked suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. Dismissed. Sarathus turned to leave. Got 3 steps before his voice stopped her. Sarathus. She looked back. Thank you. The words sounded foreign coming from him, like he hadn't said them in years, like he'd forgotten how. She nodded. Said nothing. Because what could you say to a king who thanked you for keeping the monster inside him from destroying everything he'd built? Kael was waiting outside. They walked back through the corridors in silence, up the stairs, down the hallway, to the room with the barred windows. The guard unlocked the door, stepped aside. Serathis walked in. Heard the lock turn behind her. She sat on the bed and tried to process what had just happened. The king had shown her his weakness, his vulnerability, the thing that could destroy him. Why? Because he needed her to understand, because he wanted honesty and thought showing his own would encourage hers? Or because he was testing her, seeing if she'd try to use the knowledge against him? She didn't know, but she was going to find out. The days began to blur together. Every night, the same routine. Kael would come at sundown, would lead her down to the throne room. The king would be waiting. She would dance. He would watch. The shadows would respond. The curse would quiet. And afterward, sometimes, he would talk to her. Not long conversations, not deep philosophical exchanges, just talk. About the empire, about the challenges of ruling 6 territories that barely tolerated each other, about the constant threat of rebellion, of assassination, of everything falling apart the moment he showed weakness. Sarathis listened, asked questions, learned. She learned that the northern territory was rich in iron but poor in food, that the southern packs controlled the coast and used it to strangle trade whenever they wanted concessions, that the eastern clans still practiced the old ways, the brutal traditions that most packs had abandoned, and they resented being forced into a unified empire. She learned that power at this level wasn't about strength. It was about balance, about knowing which threats to crush and which to negotiate with, about appearing strong enough that no one challenged you, but not so strong that everyone united against you. She learned that the king slept maybe 3 hours a night, that he had advisors he didn't trust and generals who were loyal only as long as he kept winning, that the empire he'd built was held together by fear and momentum and the sheer force of his will. And she learned that he was tired. Not physically. The man was built like a siege weapon, but tired in the way that came from carrying too much for too long with no end in sight. On the 7th night, after she'd finished dancing, he didn't dismiss her immediately. "Sit." He gestured to the steps of the dais. Serathis sat. The marble was cold even through her dress. The king leaned back in his throne, studied her. "You're learning the patterns of what? This place, how it works, who has power and who pretends to." "I'm observant." "You're calculating." He said it without judgment. "You're looking for leverage, for angles, for ways to survive this. Survival is what I'm good at." Malric nodded slowly. "Your uncle will come back." Sarathus had been expecting this, knew it was coming. Draven wasn't the type to let things go. "When?" "Soon. There's a gathering in 3 weeks. All the territory leaders, a celebration of the Empire's founding, mandatory attendance. And you think he'll make a move? I know he will." The king's voice carried certainty. "He brought you here to humiliate you, to prove his loyalty by offering up his worthless niece. Instead, you became valuable, necessary. That shifts the power dynamic in ways he didn't anticipate. So he'll try to eliminate me, or reclaim you, or undermine you. Draven is many things, but he's not stupid. He'll have a plan." Sarathus thought about her uncle, about the way he'd looked at her before he left, the recognition in his eyes. "What will you do?" "Protect you. You're too useful to lose, because of the curse." "Yes, not because you care if I live or die." "No." The honesty was almost refreshing. "At least you're honest about it. I've found honesty saves time." Malric stood, walked down the steps, stopped in front of her. "But understand this, useful or not, if you betray me, if you try to use what I've shown you against me, I will kill you myself, slowly, and I'll make sure everyone knows what happens to people who mistake my candor for weakness." Serathis met his eyes, didn't flinch, understood. "Good." He walked past her, stopped at the throne room doors. "Same time tomorrow." The doors opened. Kael was waiting. As Serathis followed the guard back to her room, she thought about trust, about how the king had just threatened to kill her in one breath and promised to protect her in the next, about how both statements were probably equally true. The days continued, the nights continued, the dancing continued, and Serathis began to notice something. The curse was adapting. It was subtle at first. The first night she'd danced for maybe 15 minutes, and the king had looked completely relieved, the pressure behind his eyes gone entirely. By the second week, she had to dance for 20 minutes to achieve the same effect. By the third week, 30 minutes. And even then, the relief wasn't as complete. She could see it in the way he held himself afterward. The tension that didn't quite leave his shoulders. She didn't mention it, neither did he. But they both knew. Whatever this was, whatever connection existed between her movement and his curse, it was changing, evolving. The curse was learning to resist her the way a body learns to resist medicine. On the 18th night, something broke. She was halfway through the dance when the king made a sound. Not words, just a low noise in the back of his throat. Pain and frustration compressed into a single exhalation. Serathis kept dancing, but she watched him, saw the way his hands gripped the armrests of the throne, the way his jaw clenched, the way the shadows in the room pulsed harder, darker, like they were fighting her. She pushed through, moved faster, deeper, reached for the place inside herself where the movement came from, the well she'd been drawing from all these nights. The shadows pushed back. For the first time, they pushed back. Sarathus felt it like physical resistance, like trying to move through water, through mud, through something that didn't want her to move at all. She forced through it. every muscle straining, sweat pouring down her spine. The king stood abruptly. "Stop!" His voice cracked like a whip. Serathis froze mid-movement. Malric's chest was heaving. His eyes had gone dark. Not brown anymore. Something deeper. Something that looked almost black. "Get out." "My king, I can... Get out! Now!" The command carried an edge of panic she'd never heard from him before. Sarathus turned. Ran. Not walked. Ran. Kael was already at the doors, pulling them open. They slammed shut the moment Sarathus cleared them. "What happened?" Kael's voice was sharp. "I don't know." "The curse?" It fought back. The guard's expression went grim. "We need to move. Now." They ran through the corridors, up the stairs, past confused servants who pressed themselves against walls to let them pass. Behind them, Sarathus heard it, a sound like stone cracking, like the world breaking, like every nightmare given voice. The curse had broken free. They made it to her room. Kael shoved her inside. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except me. Understand? What about... He'll contain it or he won't. Either way, you stay here." The door slammed. The lock turned. Serathis stood in the center of the room, heart hammering, and listened to the sounds filtering up through the stone. Crashes, screams, the deep subsonic rumble of power unleashed. It lasted for hours. By the time silence fell, the sun was rising. Pale light crept through the barred window, turning the stone walls gray. Serathis hadn't moved, hadn't slept. Just stood there, listening, waiting to hear if the world was ending or if somehow it had held together one more time. The lock turned. Kael stepped in. Her armor was dented, blood on her face. Not her own, judging by the way she moved. "Is he alive? Contained? Barely?" The guard's voice was rough. 15 dead, 30 wounded, half the west wing is rubble. Serathis felt her stomach drop. "I should have..." "Should have what? Danced harder?" "The curse is adapting, growing stronger. Whatever you were doing, it's not enough anymore." "Then what do we do?" Kael looked at her. Really looked at her. "We figure out what you really are. Because that wasn't just dancing, that was power. And the king's curse recognized it." She turned to leave. "Rest. You'll need it. The gathering is in 5 days." "What gathering?" "The one where your uncle makes his move." The door closed. Serathis sat on the bed. 5 days. 5 days until Draven came back. Until whatever plan he'd been formulating came to fruition. Until everything either fell apart or somehow, impossibly, came together. She looked at her hands. They were shaking. Not from fear, from something else. Because Kael was right. What she'd been doing wasn't just dancing. It was something more. Something she didn't understand. Something that lived inside her, dormant until the king's curse had called it forth. Something that was waking up. And she had 5 days to figure out what it was before her uncle tried to destroy it. Before he tried to destroy her. The gathering arrived too fast. Serathis spent the intervening days in her room. Kael brought food but didn't speak much. The king didn't summon her. She could feel the absence of the nightly routine like a missing tooth. Something that had become familiar suddenly gone. On the morning of the 5th day, Kael came with different clothes. Not a dress. Pants. A tunic. Both in deep blue, finer fabric than anything Serathis had ever worn. "You're to attend the gathering." "As what?" "The king's..." Kael paused, choosing her words carefully. "Guest. Prisoner, you mean. Call it what you want. You'll be visible. On display. And you'll behave. Or the king will make an example of you in front of every territory leader in the empire." Serathis dressed. The clothes fit well. Too well. Someone had taken her measurements while she slept or guessed with uncanny accuracy. Kael led her down through corridors she'd never seen before. These were the public spaces. Grand, intimidating. Designed to remind visitors that they were standing in the heart of an empire built on conquest. The Great Hall was massive. Vaulted ceilings 3 stories high. Chandeliers hanging from chains thick as a man's wrist. Tables arranged in careful hierarchy, with the high table on a raised platform at the far end. The room was already filling. Territory leaders and their entourages. Alphas in formal dress. which meant armor polished to a mirror shine and weapons that were decorative but still functional. The smell of too many predators in one place, leather and steel and barely controlled aggression. Sarathus felt every eye turn toward her as she entered. The whispers started immediately. The Wolfless girl, the king's dancer, Draven's niece. What's she doing here? Kael led her to a seat. Not at the high table, but close enough, visible enough. Stay here. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't draw attention. Then why am I here? Because the king wants Draven to see you, wants him to know you're under his protection, and if Draven doesn't care, then things get interesting. Kael left. Serathis sat, waited. Watched the room fill with the most powerful people in 6 territories, all of them posturing, all of them calculating, all of them looking for advantage. The doors at the far end opened. King Malric entered. The room went silent. He looked, controlled, composed. Like the events of 5 nights ago had never happened. Like he hadn't nearly destroyed half his keep. Like the curse wasn't eating him alive from the inside. But Sarathis could see it. The tightness around his eyes. The way he moved just slightly too carefully. Like he was holding himself together through will alone. He took his seat at the high table. Surveyed the room. When his gaze passed over Sarathis, he didn't pause. Didn't acknowledge her. Just kept scanning as if she were part of the furniture. Good. That's what they'd want. No appearance of favoritism. No suggestion that she mattered. The doors opened again. Draven Kor strode in like he owned the place. He didn't, but he moved like he should. Behind him, his entourage. 20 of his best. All of them loyal. All of them lethal. Draven's eyes found Sarathis immediately. He smiled. Not the performative smile from 3 weeks ago. This one was genuine. The smile of a man who'd just seen the perfect opportunity fall into his lap. He walked to the high table, bowed to the king, took his seat 3 places down. And the entire time he kept glancing at Sarathis, planning, calculating, preparing to make his move. The feast began. Food appeared in quantities designed to impress. Whole animals roasted, platters of delicacies from every territory, wine flowing freely. Sarathis didn't touch any of it. She sat, watched, waited. 2 hours into the feast, Draven stood. "My king, lords and ladies of the assembled territories," his voice carried across the hall, "I propose a toast. To unity, to strength, to the empire that has brought us all together under one banner." Everyone raised their cups, the king included. They drank. Serathis watched Draven's face, watched the satisfaction that flickered across it for just a moment, too brief, too controlled. Something was wrong. The king set down his cup, reached for another piece of meat. His hand stopped halfway there, froze in midair. Malric's face went pale, then gray. His eyes widened. The curse. But not like before. This was different, faster, stronger. This was poison. Draven had poisoned him. Not to kill him. That would be too obvious, but to trigger the curse, to unleash it here, in front of everyone, to prove the king was unstable, dangerous, unfit to rule. The king stood, swayed, gripped the edge of the table hard enough to crack the wood. "My king." One of his advisors stepped forward. Malric held up a hand, stopped him. His voice came out strangled, clear. "The hall. Now." No one moved. They were frozen, watching, waiting to see what happened next. I said. The king's voice cracked. The shadows exploded. They burst from him like a dam breaking. Black, viscous, consuming. They spread across the floor, up the walls, swallowing light wherever they touched. Screams filled the hall. People ran, scrambled for the exits, trampled each other in their panic. The shadows kept spreading. And in the center of it all, King Malric Veyron collapsed to his knees, body convulsing, the curse ripping through him without mercy. Draven stood, walked calmly toward the exit. Mission accomplished. The king exposed as a monster, the empire about to tear itself apart. This was it. The moment Sarathis was meant to run, to survive, to let the world burn and save herself. But she didn't. She stood, walked toward the king, toward the shadows. toward certain death, because she'd already made her choice. She wasn't going to survive this world. She was going to take it. The shadows recognized her before she recognized them. That was the first surprise. The second was that they didn't consume her the way they consumed everything else they touched. They parted. Not like water around a stone. Like subjects before a queen they'd been waiting for. Serathis walked through the chaos, through the screaming, through the mass of bodies scrambling for exits that were too few and too far away. She walked through the spreading darkness that had already claimed 3 people, their bodies dissolving into ash, their screams cutting off mid-breath. She walked toward the king. He was on his knees still, head thrown back, every muscle locked in a spasm of agony. The shadows poured from him in waves, each one darker than the last. His eyes had gone completely black, not the brown black from before, true black, void black, the color of nothing. Sarathus reached him, knelt in front of him, put her hands on either side of his face. The shadows surged toward her hands, wrapped around her wrists. Should have burned through skin and bone. Should have reduced her to ash like the others. Didn't. They coiled around her forearms like serpents, like they were trying to understand what she was, why she wasn't afraid. Sarathus looked into the king's black eyes and saw nothing human looking back. Just the curse. Just the thing that had been eating him alive for 7 years, finally unleashed, finally free to destroy everything in its path. Look at me. Her voice was steady, calm, the same voice she'd used every night when she danced. The king's eyes focused, just barely, just enough. Malric, look at me. His mouth opened. What came out wasn't words, just a sound, raw, broken, the sound of a man being torn apart from the inside. Serathis began to move, not standing, kneeling there in front of him. She moved her arms, her shoulders, her spine, creating the same patterns she'd created every night for 3 weeks, the same language her body had been speaking to his curse. But this time she wasn't trying to calm it. She was trying to control it. The shadows hesitated. That was new. They'd responded to her before, quieted when she danced. But this was different. This was recognition, like they were asking her a question and waiting for an answer. So she answered. She let herself fall deeper into the movement, deeper than she'd ever gone, past the place where conscious thought lived, past fear, past survival instinct, down into the well she'd been drawing from all these weeks, the place inside herself that she'd never fully explored because she'd been too afraid of what she might find there. And at the bottom of that well, waiting in the dark, power. Not the kind that came from physical strength, not the kind that came from a wolf. This was something older, something that predated the shift, predated the pacts, predated the entire structure of dominance that their world was built on. This was the power of entropy itself, the power of things that break down, dissolve, return to shadow and silence. The power that had been sleeping inside her, dormant since the day she was born, suppressed by the same forces that should have given her a wolf, buried so deep that even she hadn't known it existed, until the king's curse had called to it, like recognizing like. The shadows stopped spreading, pulled back, just a little, just enough. The king's breathing changed, the spasms eased. His eyes, still black, still wrong, found hers. What are you doing? His voice came from somewhere far away, strangled, barely human, saving you. Sarathus moved faster. Let the power flow through her. Let it pour out in waves that matched the curse's rhythm, that spoke its language, that commanded it in ways she didn't fully understand but trusted anyway because she had no other choice. The shadows began to retract, slowly at first, reluctantly, like they were being pulled back against their will, then faster. They poured back into the king, back through his skin, back into whatever hollow place inside him they called home. Malric collapsed forward. Serathis caught him, barely. He was twice her size, but she held him up through will and desperation and the last dregs of whatever strength the power had given her. His eyes cleared, brown again, human again. He stared at her, disbelief, confusion, and underneath it all, fear. How? That was all he managed. One word, but it carried the weight of everything he couldn't say. I don't know. Sarathus was shaking now. The power was draining out of her, leaving her hollow and cold and more tired than she'd ever been in her life. The great hall was silent, Everyone who hadn't made it to the exit stood frozen, staring at her, at the king, at the shadows that had stopped spreading and started retreating for the first time in 7 years. And standing near the doors, watching with an expression that cycled through shock and fury and cold calculation, Draven. He hadn't left, hadn't run. He'd stayed to watch his plan unfold, to see the king destroy himself in front of every territory leader in the empire. Instead, he'd watched his niece do the impossible. Their eyes met across the hall, and Serathis saw the decision form behind his eyes before he made it. If he couldn't destroy her through the king's curse, he'd destroy her the old-fashioned way. Seize her. Draven's voice cut through the silence like a blade. His guards moved immediately. 20 of them, converging on Serathis from multiple directions. Kael appeared from somewhere, putting herself between them and Serathis. But 20 against 1 wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Stop! The king's voice was weak, thready, but still carrying command. The guards hesitated. Draven stepped forward, playing to the crowd now, to the territory leaders who were still trying to process what they'd just witnessed. My king, with respect, that girl just demonstrated power we don't understand. Power that could be a threat to us all. She must be contained, studied, controlled. He made it sound reasonable, responsible. The voice of a concerned advisor protecting his king. She saved his life, Kael said, her hand on her sword. Ready, or she caused the problem in the first place. We don't know what she is, what she's capable of. Draven turned to face the assembled crowd. I brought her here as tribute. I claimed she might have dormant powers from old bloodlines. I was right. But I never claimed those powers would be safe, would be controllable. He gestured toward the bodies that had dissolved into ash. Look what happened when the king's curse broke free. Look at the destruction. And now we discover this wolfless girl, this thing that shouldn't exist, can control that same power? He let the implications hang in the air. What happens when she decides to use it against us? Against any of us? Murmurs rippled through the crowd, fear mixing with suspicion. The territory leaders exchanging glances. Calculating. Because Draven was right about one thing. They didn't know what Sarathus was. Didn't understand what they'd just witnessed, and people feared what they didn't understand. Malric tried to stand, made it halfway before his legs gave out. The curse had taken too much. The poison was still in his system. He didn't have the strength to enforce his will right now. For the first time in 7 years, the king was weak, and everyone in this room knew it. Draven saw his opportunity. I propose we take the girl into custody. Temporary. Just until we can understand what she is, what she can do, for the safety of the empire. He looked at the territory leaders, one by one. All in favor? This was it, the moment. If enough of them sided with Draven, the king's authority would crumble. The empire would fracture, and Sarathus would be handed over to her uncle, who would make sure she never used her power against him or anyone else. The northern territory leader raised his hand, then the eastern, then the southern. One by one, they voted. Against the king. Against Serathis. Malric's face went hard. He tried to stand again, failed again. The effort cost him. She could see it in the way he paled, the way his hands shook. You would defy me. In my own hall. His voice was stronger now, anger giving him strength where his body had none. We serve the empire, my king, not any one man. If you are compromised, I am not compromised. Then prove it. Draven's voice carried a challenge now. Open, direct, stand. Command your guards. Take control of this situation. Show us you're still fit to rule. Silence. Malric tried. He put his hands on the floor, pushed, got his legs under him, and collapsed. The sound of the king hitting the stone floor echoed through the hall, and with it, any illusion of his invulnerability shattered. Draven nodded to his guards. Take her. They moved. Kael drew her sword, managed to take down 2 before the rest overwhelmed her. They didn't kill her, just disarmed her. Threw her aside. Sarathus didn't run, didn't fight, because she'd seen something in that moment when the shadows had retracted, when they'd poured back into the king. They hadn't wanted to go. They'd wanted to stay with her. The guards grabbed her arms, pulled them behind her back. started to drag her toward the doors. And the shadows, the king's shadows, surged, not from him this time, from her. They exploded outward in a wave of darkness so complete it swallowed the light from every chandelier, every torch, every source of illumination in the hall. The guards holding her screamed, "Let go!" Scrambled backward. The shadows wrapped around Serathis like armor, like a second skin. They didn't hurt her, didn't burn. They felt right, like coming home to a place she'd never known existed. And standing in the center of that darkness, Serathis finally understood. She wasn't broken. She'd never been broken. She'd been sealed. Someone, something, had locked this power inside her at birth, buried it so deep that even she couldn't feel it, couldn't access it, made her appear wolfless when in fact she carried something far more dangerous than any wolf, the power of dissolution itself, the ability to break things down to their base components, to return them to shadow and silence and the void they came from. It was the opposite of creation, the opposite of life, and it had been waiting inside her all this time. The shadows retracted slowly, deliberately, pulling back to reveal Sarathus standing alone in the center of the hall, every eye fixed on her. But she wasn't the same person who'd walked into this gathering. That person had been small, invisible, nothing. The woman standing here now, she was something else entirely. Draven stared at her. For the first time since she'd known him, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. "What have you done?" He said it quietly, like he was asking himself more than her. Sarathus met his gaze, held it. "I survived you." The words came out cold, flat, absolute. Draven's fear crystallized into rage. "Kill her!" The command was immediate, desperate. His guards hesitated. They'd just watched shadows pour from this girl like she was made of darkness. Watched her do something no one had done in 7 years, control the king's curse. Now. Draven's voice cracked like a whip. They moved. Because they were loyal, because they feared him more than they feared her, because orders were orders and they'd been trained to follow them. 20 guards converging on one girl. Serathis raised her hand. The shadows responded. They didn't explode this time. Didn't surge. They moved with precision, with purpose, like extensions of her will made manifest. They wrapped around the guards, not violently, almost gently, and one by one the guards stopped moving, stopped breathing, fell to the ground like puppets with cut strings. Not dead. Sarathus could feel that somehow, just stopped, suspended, caught between one heartbeat and the next. The hall erupted into chaos. Territory leaders scrambling for exits, servants screaming, guards drawing weapons but not sure who to point them at. And in the center of it all, Draven and Serathis, staring at each other across 20 feet of stone floor littered with fallen bodies. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," Serathis' voice carried across the noise. "You were nothing, a mistake, a burden." Draven's voice shook with fury. "I raised you, fed you, kept you alive when everyone said I should have exposed you at birth. You kept me alive because killing me would have looked bad, because my father's memory still carried weight, because you needed to appear merciful." She took a step toward him. "But you never saw me as a person, never saw me as anything but a problem to be managed, a tool to be used. Another step, so you brought me here. Offered me to a king you knew would either kill me or use me. Either way, I'd be gone. Your problem solved." She stopped 10 feet away from him. "But I didn't die, didn't disappear. I became useful, necessary. And that terrified you. Because useful people have value, and value is power." Draven's hand went to his sword. "You think you have power now? You think controlling some shadows makes you strong?" He drew the blade. "You're still nothing, still broken, still the same worthless girl I should have drowned 20 years ago." Serathis felt the shadows coil around her arms, felt the power waiting, ready. One thought and she could end him, could reduce him to ash like the others, could make him disappear like he'd tried to make her disappear. But that would be too quick, too merciful. And Serathis had learned something important over the past 3 weeks, something the king had taught her without meaning to. Power wasn't about strength. It was about control, about knowing when to strike and when to wait, about understanding that the most effective revenge wasn't the fastest, it was the most complete. So instead of killing him, she did something worse. She turned her back on him. walked away, toward the king. Malric had managed to sit up. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read, part fear, part awe, part something else. Draven's roar of rage echoed through the hall. She heard him charge, heard his boots against stone, heard the whistle of his blade cutting air. The shadows moved without her conscious command. They caught him mid-stride, lifted him off his feet, held him suspended 3 feet off the ground, sword still raised, face twisted in fury. Serathis didn't even look back. She knelt beside the king. "Can you stand?" Malric stared at her, at the shadows holding her uncle frozen, at the bodies scattered across his hall, at the empire teetering on the edge of collapse. "What are you?" "The same thing you are." Serathis held out her hand, cursed. The king looked at her hand, at her face, making calculations she couldn't follow. Then he took it. She pulled him to his feet. He swayed but stayed upright. The poison was wearing off. The curse was quiet, for now. Together they turned to face the hall. The territory leaders had stopped running, were watching, waiting to see what happened next, waiting to see who held power here. Malric's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of 7 years of rule. 7 years of conquest and consolidation and the systematic destruction of anyone who challenged him. Anyone who raises arms against the crown will be executed. Anyone who conspires against the empire will be stripped of title and territory. Anyone who questions my authority. Samoshi. He paused, looked at Sarathus. Or hers, will learn what it means to face true power. The words landed like hammer blows. Sarathus felt every eye in the hall turn toward her. Hers. The king had just granted her authority, had just made her, what? An advisor? A weapon? A partner? She didn't know. Didn't have time to process it. Because Draven chose that moment to find his voice. You would side with this abomination? This thing that should never have been born? The shadows tightened around him. Not enough to hurt. Just enough to remind him who controlled them. Malric's voice went cold. I side with the person who saved my life, who controlled a curse that's been killing me for 7 years, who demonstrated more loyalty in 3 weeks than you've shown in a lifetime of service. But she's nothing, Draven spat. Wolfless, barren, a mistake of nature. She's the future. The king's words fell into absolute silence. And you? He looked at Draven with contempt so pure it was almost beautiful. You're the past. He nodded to Serathis. She understood. The shadows contracted. Draven's scream cut off abruptly. His body went rigid. The blade fell from his hand, clattering against stone. Serathis didn't kill him. That would have been mercy. Instead, she took his wolf. She didn't know how she knew she could do it. Didn't know the mechanism. But the power understood. It reached inside him, found the part that made him alpha, the beast that gave him strength and status and authority, and tore it out. Draven's scream when it returned was inhuman, primal, the sound of a man being unmade. The shadows released him. He collapsed, curled into a ball on the stone floor, sobbing, broken, wolfless, just like her. Serathis looked at the assembled territory leaders, at the guards, at the servants, at everyone who'd watched her uncle offer her his tribute 3 weeks ago. Let this be a lesson, her voice carried through the hall, clear, absolute. Power doesn't come from what you were born with. It comes from what you survive, what you endure, what you become when the world tries to break you and fails. She gestured to Draven's broken form. He tried to destroy me because I was different, because I didn't fit his definition of strength, because I threatened his understanding of how power works. She turned to face them fully. How many of you have done the same? How many of you have discarded someone because they didn't meet your standards, because they were born wrong, because they were inconvenient? Silence. From now on, things change. The empire doesn't just belong to the strong. It belongs to the persistent, the adaptable, the ones who refuse to break no matter how hard you push. Malric was watching her with something like wonder. Well said. His voice was quiet, meant just for her. Did you mean it? Every word. Then we have work to do. He raised his voice, addressed the hall, addressed the gathering is over. Return to your territories. When you return for the next assembly, be prepared. The Empire is evolving. Adapt or be left behind. The threat was implicit, clear. The territory leaders began filing out, slowly, carefully, like they were afraid sudden movements might trigger another explosion of power. Draven remained on the floor, sobbing, broken. Kael approached, bowed to the king, then to Serathis. What should we do with him? Serathis looked at her uncle, at the man who'd made her life torture for 23 years, who'd used her, humiliated her, offered her to a king like she was garbage. She should kill him, should end this, remove the threat completely. But she didn't. Send him back to Ironfang territory, stripped of rank, stripped of title. Let him live the rest of his life as what he made me. Nothing. Kael nodded, gestured to guards. They dragged Draven away. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just stared at Serathis with eyes that had gone hollow. Empty. The hall emptied slowly, until it was just Serathis and the king and a handful of guards keeping their distance. Malric sat on the steps of the dais, looked exhausted, but alive. More alive than she'd seen him in weeks. You took his wolf? Yes. I didn't know that was possible. Neither did I. What else can you do? Sarathus sat beside him, looked at her hands, at the shadows that still clung to her fingers like smoke. I don't know. I'm still figuring it out. We need to understand this. Understand you. What you are. Where this power comes from. Why? Because power without understanding is dangerous. For you. For everyone around you. He had a point. There are texts, archives, records from before the unification, from when the old kingdom still stood. If your power is as ancient as I think it is, there might be answers there. Sarathus processed that, felt the exhaustion catching up with her, the crash after the adrenaline. Tomorrow. We can start tomorrow. Agreed. They sat in silence for a moment. Two broken people in the wreckage of what should have been a celebration. You called me the future. Malric nodded. I meant it. Why? Because the empire I built, it's founded on strength, on dominance, on the idea that the strong deserve to rule and the weak deserve to submit. He looked at her. But you're neither strong nor weak. You're something else. Something that doesn't fit the categories we've built our entire society around. And if someone like you can have power, can command respect through something other than brute force, it changes everything. Exactly. Serathis thought about that, about what it meant, about the responsibility. I didn't ask for this. No one asks for power. It's thrust upon them. The question is what you do with it. What do you think I should do with it? Malric stood, offered her his hand. Help me rebuild, not the empire I created through conquest. Something better. Something that doesn't grind people like you into dust just because they're different. She took his hand. Let him pull her to her feet. That's ambitious. I'm a king. Ambition is the job description. Almost a joke. Almost. They walked toward the exit together. The shadows followed Serathis like a cloak, like servants, like they recognized her as something they should obey. At the doors, Malric stopped. Serathis. She looked at him. Thank you. For saving my life. For not running when you had every reason to. I told you. I'm not surviving this world anymore. Then what are you doing? Taking it. The king smiled. Genuine this time. Tired, but real. Good. Because it needs taking. They stepped out into the corridor. Into whatever came next. Behind them, the great hall stood empty. Littered with the debris of an empire that had just discovered it didn't understand power as well as it thought it did. And in the shadows that still clung to the walls, something ancient stirred. Recognized, waited, because Serathis Vale had just done something no one had done in 1,000 years. She'd awakened a force that had been sleeping since before the Pax existed, since before the shift, since before anyone remembered there was another kind of power beyond teeth and claws and dominance, the power of entropy, of endings, of things returning to the void they came from. And now that it was awake, now that it had found a host who could wield it, nothing would ever be the same. The empire would change, the Pax would change, the entire structure of their world would have to change, because the rules had just been rewritten by a girl who wasn't supposed to exist, by a woman who'd been nothing, and had become everything. The archives were buried 3 levels below the keep, in chambers so old the stone had turned to something harder than granite from centuries of compression and darkness. Serathis stood at the entrance, staring down a corridor lined with shelves that disappeared into shadow. Dust hung in the air like suspended time. The smell of old parchment and decay was thick enough to taste. "This is everything?" Her voice echoed strangely in the confined space. King Malric stood beside her, a torch in his hand casting flickering light across shelves packed with scrolls and bound volumes and loose pages that looked like they'd crumble if you breathed on them too hard. Everything we salvaged from the fallen kingdoms. Everything we could recover after the unification wars. Most of it's inventories, tax records, correspondence between minor lords about grain shipments and marriage contracts. He gestured deeper into the archives. But somewhere in here, if the stories are true, there are texts from before, from when the old powers still walked the world. What old powers? The ones that gave us the shift. The ones that turned humans into wolves and created the packs in the first place. Sarathus processed that. She'd grown up with the myths every pack child had. Stories about the first shift, about the gods or spirits or forces of nature that had granted certain bloodlines the ability to transform, to hunt, to become something more than human. But those were just stories, weren't they? Malric saw the skepticism on her face. 3 weeks ago, you were wolfless, powerless. Nothing. Now you can control shadows and strip the wolf from an alpha's soul. You want to tell me the old stories are just myths? Fair point. They descended into the archives. Kael followed at a distance, silent as always. She'd become Serathis' shadow over the past 3 days. Not a guard exactly. More like a witness. Someone who decided that whatever Serathis was becoming, she wanted to be there when it happened. The shelves stretched on forever. Serathis ran her fingers along the spines of books so old the titles had worn away, pulled out scrolls at random, unrolled them carefully, found nothing but merchant manifests and property disputes. This could take months. We don't have months, Malric's voice was tight. The territory leaders went back to their lands 3 days ago. By now, word is spread. About what you did. About what you are. They're scared. And scared people do 2 things. They submit or they fight. You think they'll fight. I know they will. The northern territories are already mobilizing. I have reports of increased military activity along 3 borders. They're calling it defensive preparations. But it's not. It's preparation for war. Malric set the torch in a sconce on the wall, turned to face her directly. They saw what you did to Draven, saw you take his wolf, his very identity, his soul, by pack law. That terrifies them. Because if you can do it to him, you can do it to any of them. So they'll try to destroy me before I can, before we can. You're under my protection now. An attack on you is an attack on the crown. That just makes me a bigger target. Yes. At least he was honest about it. Serathis moved deeper into the archives. Let her instincts guide her. The shadows that clung to her seemed to thicken down here, like they recognized this place, like they'd been here before. She stopped at a shelf near the back. Something pulled at her attention. Not a sound, not a sight, just a feeling. Like standing near a cliff edge in the dark. You can't see the drop, but you know it's there. Her hand reached out, found a book. The binding was black. Not leather. Something else, something that felt organic but wrong. Like skin that had been cured in ways that shouldn't be possible. She pulled it free. Dust cascaded from the shelf. The cover had no title, no markings, just smooth black material that was somehow warm to the touch. Malric moved closer. His torch illuminated the book. I've never seen that before. You've been down here? A few times. Looking for answers about the curse. I searched for months. Never found anything useful. Maybe you weren't looking for the right thing. Serathis opened the book. The pages were parchment. Thin. Covered in script so dense it was almost unreadable. But not any language she recognized. The letters were wrong. Twisted. Like they'd been written by someone whose hands didn't bend the same way human hands bent. And yet, she could read it. Not with her eyes. With something else. The shadows curled around her shoulders, leaning in close like they were reading over her shoulder, and somehow their presence made the words make sense. What does it say? Malric's voice was careful, controlled, but she could hear the tension underneath. Serathis skimmed the page, then the next, then flipped ahead, reading faster now, the words pouring into her mind in a way that bypassed normal comprehension. It's a history of the powers that existed before the shift, before the pacts. She paused, reread a section to make sure she understood it correctly. There were two forces, creation and dissolution, life and entropy. The wolves came from creation, from the force that builds and grows and multiplies. And the other force? That's what I am. The words fell into silence. Malric stared at her. You're saying you're the opposite of what we are, the antithesis. Not the opposite, the balance. One can't exist without the other. Creation needs destruction. Growth needs decay. The wolves were never meant to exist alone. Then where have you been? Where have people like you been for the past 1,000 years? Sarathus read further. The text got darker here, more disturbing, sealed, suppressed, hunted down and destroyed before their powers could manifest. Because the wolves won the first war, created a society built on their strength, and anyone who carried the other power, the dissolution, was seen as a threat. She looked up at him. They killed us. Systematically. For generations. Until we were almost extinct, and the few who survived learned to hide what they were, to bury it so deep that even they forgot. Like you. Like me. Malric's jaw tightened. This changes everything. If what you're saying is true, if there are others like you, there aren't. Or if there are, they're so deeply suppressed they'll never manifest. The book says it requires a trigger, something powerful enough to crack the seal, like my curse. Serathis nodded. Your curse called to my power because they're the same thing. Both tied to dissolution, to breaking things down. It recognized me because I'm the only one who could understand it, control it, or be consumed by it. The new voice came from behind them. Serathis spun. A figure stood at the entrance to the archive. Tall, robed in gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, face hidden by a deep hood that cast shadows too dark to be natural. Kyle's sword was out instantly. She positioned herself between Sarathus and the newcomer, blade steady, stance perfect. Identify yourself. The figure raised empty hands, stepped into the torchlight with movements that seemed to flow rather than walk. When the hood fell back, Sarathus saw a woman, old, ancient maybe, with eyes that had seen too much and survived anyway. Scars covered half her face, not from battle, but from something else, something that had tried to burn through her skin from the inside. The marks were familiar. Sarathus had seen similar patterns in the mirror lately, faint tracings on her own skin where the shadows touched most often. My name is Vrash. I was a keeper of the old knowledge. Before the purges, before the wolves decided that only their kind of power deserved to exist, the king's hand went to his sword. How did you get past my guards? I've been living in these archives for 20 years, hidden in chambers you don't know exist. I've watched you search for answers about your curse. Watched you fail. Because you were looking in the wrong places. Looking for cures when what you needed was understanding. Vrash's gaze shifted to Sarathus. Those ancient eyes seemed to see straight through flesh and bone to whatever burned underneath. But when she arrived, when she awakened, I knew it was time. Time for what? To finish what should have been finished 1,000 years ago. The old woman moved closer. Kyle's blade tracked her movement but didn't strike. Something in Vrash's posture suggested violence would be pointless. The wolves and the void touched, that's what we were called before the purges, were meant to coexist, to balance each other. Creation and dissolution in harmony. But the wolves got greedy, wanted all the power for themselves, so they hunted us, killed us, tried to erase us from history like we'd never existed. Vrash stopped a few feet away. You, girl, are the first void touch to fully manifest in 3 centuries. And him? She nodded toward Malric. His curse is a remnant, a fragment of void power that attached itself to his bloodline. Punishment for his ancestors' role in the purges. The king's face had gone pale. My bloodline was cursed? Your bloodline created the curse. Your great-great-grandfather led the final purge, killed the last known void touched and their families, wiped out entire villages to make sure the power died with them, burned the children alive because they might carry the gift, razed temples, destroyed knowledge, tried to erase an entire half of existence because it frightened him. Vrash's voice carried the weight of old anger, old grief that had calcified into something harder than hate. But power like that doesn't die. It lingers, waits. And when his descendant unified the territories, when you claimed dominion over lands that used to belong to the void touched, it woke up, latched onto you, started eating you alive as payment for what your ancestor did. Serathis felt the pieces clicking into place. The reason the curse had quieted when she danced, the reason it recognized her, the reason it wanted to stay with her instead of him, it was trying to go home. Vrash smiled, grim, humorless, the expression of someone who'd outlived joy. Yes. The curse is void power without a host, incomplete, dangerous. It's been trying to return to its source for 7 years, and now, she gestured to Serathis, it found one. Is that why I can control it? You don't control it, child. You commune with it, speak its language. But make no mistake, void power isn't meant to be controlled. It's meant to be balanced, channeled, respected. It's the force that returns all things to silence, to stillness, to the void from which everything came. Vrash's expression darkened, and if you try to wield it like a weapon without understanding what it is, it will consume you, burn through you, leave nothing but ash and regret. And if I can't do that, can't balance it, then it will consume you the same way it's been consuming him, maybe faster since you're untrained, unprepared, since you're drawing on it instinctively instead of with discipline. The old woman pulled something from her robes, a small vial, dark liquid inside that seemed to move on its own, pulsing like a heartbeat. This is distilled void essence, concentrated, dangerous, the last of its kind. If you drink it, your power will magnify 100-fold. You'll be able to do things the old void-touched could only dream of. You'll be able to face an army and make them fear the darkness itself. She paused. Let the implications settle, but it will also accelerate the consumption. You'll have days, maybe hours, before the power burns through you completely, before you become nothing more than shadow and memory. Why would I take that? Because war is coming, and you'll need every advantage you can get. Malric stepped forward. What war? The one the territory leaders are already preparing, but not just them. Vrash's expression grew grimmer. Word of what happened at the gathering has spread beyond the 6 territories, to the wild packs, the exiled clans, the wolves who never submitted to your empire, to the old families who still remember the purges and believe they were justified. Her voice dropped lower. They're coming, all of them, united by one goal: destroy the void touched before she destroys them. Sarathus felt ice slide down her spine. How many? Thousands. Maybe more. Every pack that's ever resented your rule, every alpha who's ever wanted to challenge you, every wolf who fears what she represents. They're calling it a holy war, a cleansing. They believe she's the harbinger of another age of darkness. Vrash looked between them. They're gathering at the northern border, building forces, sharpening weapons, preparing to march on the capital. When they come, they won't stop until every void touched is dead, until every trace of the old power is wiped from existence. When? 3 days, maybe 4. They're gathering at the borderlands. When they move, they'll come fast. Hit the capital before you can properly mobilize a defense. Malric's face had gone hard, calculating. The expression of a king who'd fought too many wars to panic, but understood when the odds were impossible. I have troops, loyal packs. We can mount a defense against thousands of wolves who are fighting for their survival, who believe you've allied with the very thing their ancestors died to destroy. Vrash shook her head. You'll be outnumbered 5-1, and that's if your own packs don't turn on you first. Half of them are terrified of her. The other half are waiting to see which side will win before they commit. She held out the vial to Serathis. This is your choice. Take it. Become powerful enough to fight back. Become the weapon they fear, but burn out in the process. Or refuse it. Try to fight with what you have, and probably lose anyway. Sarathus stared at the vial, at the dark liquid inside that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, at the choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Here's what she understood about power, about the kind of strength that mattered when everything was falling apart. It wasn't about how long you lasted. It wasn't about surviving until tomorrow. It was about what you could accomplish with the time you had, about making every moment count for something beyond yourself. She'd spent 23 years surviving, being nothing, enduring, waiting for permission to exist. She was done waiting. This was the choice then, the real one. Not whether to survive or die, but how to die. Fast and powerful, leaving a mark they could never erase, or slow and weak, forgotten before her body was cold. There's another option, Malric's voice cut through her thoughts. We run, leave the capital, disappear into the territories they don't control, let the empire fall, build something new somewhere they can't find us. And how many people die while we're running? Serathis met his eyes. How many servants, guards, innocent people who had nothing to do with this? You think the wolves will stop at us? They'll burn the capital, kill anyone loyal to you, turn this into another purge, history repeating because no one had the courage to stop it. I know. The king's voice was heavy with the weight of impossible choices. But you dying won't stop that. Taking that vial won't stop that. At best, you buy us a few more days. At worst, you burn out before the fight even starts, and we lose anyway. Maybe. But at least I'll go down fighting. At least I'll show them that void-touched aren't victims anymore. Aren't things to be hunted and killed and erased from history. Sarathus reached for the vial. Malric's hand caught her wrist. His grip was iron, desperate. Don't! His voice cracked on the word. I've watched enough people sacrifice themselves for this empire. For me. For ideals that don't matter when you're dead. I won't watch you do the same. You don't get to make that choice for me. No. But I can ask you not to. I can tell you that losing you would be worse than losing the empire. That I'd rather burn it all down than watch you destroy yourself. Since when do you care? The question came out harsher than she meant it. Malric's expression shifted, something raw behind his eyes. Since the first night you danced, and I realized you were the only person in 7 years who'd looked at me and seen something other than a king or a monster. Since you walked into shadows that should have killed you just to pull me out. Since you became the only thing in this cursed existence that makes me remember what it's like to feel human. He pulled her closer. So don't ask me when I started caring, ask me when I'll stop. And the answer is never. The words hung between them, raw, honest, the kind of truth that couldn't be unsaid. And Serathis felt something inside her chest crack open, because she'd been trying so hard not to care, trying to keep this transactional, survival, strategy, nothing more. But caring doesn't ask permission. It grows in the spaces between words, in the silences, in the moments when someone sees you, really sees you, and doesn't look away. She'd fallen in love with a king who was dying from the inside out, and he'd fallen in love with a girl who was about to do the same. The tragedy of it would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. I have to. Her voice was quiet. You don't. Yes, I do. Because if I don't, thousands die. Because if I run, I prove them right, that void-touched are cowards. Monsters. Things that should be destroyed. She pulled her wrist free, because for the first time in my life, I have the power to change something, to matter. And I won't waste that just to survive a few more years in hiding. That's not living. Maybe not, but it's purpose. And purpose is worth dying for. Before he could stop her, she took the vial from Vrash's outstretched hand. Serathis. Malric's voice was desperate now. She looked at him. Really looked. Memorized the planes of his face, the scar, the eyes that had seen too much, the mouth that could command armies but was begging her not to do this. When this is over, make sure they remember, not just me, all of us. Every void touched who was killed, erased, forgotten. Promise me. The king's jaw clenched. I promise. Good. She uncorked the vial and drank. The liquid was cold going down. Colder than ice. Colder than death. Like swallowing the void itself. Like drinking distilled entropy. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the power hit. It exploded through her body like lightning made of darkness. Like fire that burned cold instead of hot. Every nerve ending ignited at once. She felt herself falling, but couldn't tell if she was falling down or up or sideways because direction had lost all meaning. The shadows erupted from her skin, not carefully, not controlled. They poured out in waves, in torrents, in a flood of darkness so complete it swallowed the torchlight, the archive, everything. The world disappeared into absolute black. Serathis heard Malric shouting, felt hands on her shoulders trying to anchor her, but it was distant, muted, like listening to someone yell from the bottom of an ocean. The power was everywhere now. In her blood, in her bones, in every cell of her body rewriting itself, taking the small spark she'd had and fanning it into an inferno that consumed everything it touched. And it hurt. It hurt in ways she didn't have words for, like being torn apart and rebuilt simultaneously, like dying and being born at the same time, like every ending and every beginning happening in the same instant. She screamed. The shadows responded. They lashed out, struck the walls, the ceiling, the shelves. Stone cracked. Ancient books disintegrated into ash. The very air seemed to fracture under the weight of the power pouring through her, and through it all she could feel the void burning through her, consuming her from the inside out, rewriting what it meant to be human, to be alive, to be anything other than shadow and silence. 18 hours. Vrash's voice cut through the chaos. Maybe less. Use them well. The darkness receded slowly, reluctantly, pulled back into Sarathus' skin like a tide returning to the ocean. She found herself on her knees. Malric was in front of her, hands on her face, saying something she couldn't quite process yet. His mouth was moving, but the words took time to penetrate. The world came back into focus. "Are you insane?" His voice was raw, angry, terrified. Probably. Her own voice sounded different, deeper, like it was coming from somewhere farther away than her throat, like the void itself was speaking through her. "You just condemned yourself to die. I was already going to die. We all were. Now I'll just do it on my terms." Sarathus stood. Her legs felt strange, stronger, like they could carry weight that should break bones, like gravity had loosened its hold on her. She looked at her hands. The shadows clung to them like living gloves, solid, tangible, under her control in a way they'd never been before. The power pulsed inside her, waiting, ready. "How long?" Vrash's voice. Clinical, detached, the tone of someone who'd watched this happen before and knew exactly how it ended. "How long do I have? Based on your size and the dose you took?" 18 hours. Maybe 20 if you're very lucky and very disciplined. But every time you use the power, it burns faster. Every shadow you summon, every command you give, it consumes you. And what can I do with it? Anything. Everything. You're the most powerful void touch to exist in 3 centuries. For the next 18 hours, you're effectively a force of nature. Unstoppable. Inevitable. Vrash's expression softened slightly, almost pitying. "Make them count." Serathis turned to Malric. His face was a mask of controlled anguish. "Mobilize your forces, every loyal pack, every guard, every soldier who'll answer your call. Position them at the northern walls. We can't win." You heard her. We're outnumbered 5-1. We don't need to win. We need to hold them long enough. Long enough for what? For me to end this. For me to show them what happens when they corner something with nothing left to lose. She started toward the exit, each step more certain than the last. "Sarathus." Malric's voice stopped her. She looked back. "If you do this, if you go out there, you're not coming back. You understand that?" "I know. Then why? Why throw your life away for an empire that did nothing but hurt you? For people who called you worthless?" She thought about that. About all the reasons. About revenge and justice and proving something to people who'd never valued her. But in the end, it came down to something simpler, something more fundamental. Because someone has to stand. And for the first time in my life, I have the power to be that someone, to be the thing that doesn't break, that doesn't run, that fights back. That's not a reason to die. No. But it's a reason to matter, even if it's just for 18 hours. She held his gaze. And mattering, truly mattering, is worth more than a lifetime of survival. She left before he could argue further, before the look in his eyes could make her reconsider, before love could override purpose. Kael followed silently. They climbed back through the archives, up the stairs, through corridors that seemed different now, smaller, like the world had shrunk or she'd expanded beyond the confines of normal existence. "We need to prepare you." Kael's voice was steady, professional, but Serathis could hear the emotion underneath. The guard led her to the armory, found pieces that might fit. Not full plate, that would slow her down and she needed speed. Just chest protection made of hardened leather. Bracers reinforced with steel. Leg guards. Enough to keep a blade from killing her instantly, but light enough to move like water. As Sarathus strapped on the armor with hands that no longer shook, Kael spoke quietly. "Why did you drink it? You could have run, hidden, survived. Survival isn't enough anymore. It never was. I just didn't know it until now. Then what is enough? Making sure what I die for creates something better than what came before. Making sure the next person like me doesn't have to make this choice." The guard was quiet for a long moment. Then, "For what it's worth, I would have done the same. I think most people would, if they had your courage. That's either very brave or very stupid. Both, probably." Almost a smile passed between them. Brief, fragile. The kind of moment that happens between people who know they're living through something that will either kill them or change them forever. The alarm bells started ringing, deep, resonant, the sound that meant the Empire was under attack, the sound that meant everything was about to fall apart. "They're early." Kael's hand went to her sword. Sarathus walked to the nearest window, looked north toward the borderlands. On the horizon, darkness moved. Not natural darkness, not clouds or storm. An army. Thousands of shapes flowing across the landscape like a plague, like inevitability made manifest. Wolves, coming for blood, coming for her. Malric appeared in the doorway, already in full armor, already carrying the weight of command on his shoulders. "They're here. 3 days early. They must have forced march through day and night, must have known we'd need time to prepare and decided not to give us any. How long until they reach the walls? An hour. Maybe less if they're running. And they will be. Wolves don't walk into battle, they sprint. Then we don't have time for speeches or strategy sessions." Serathis turned to face them both. "Kael, get to the walls, organize the archers. I want volleys timed and coordinated. Make every arrow count because we won't get a second chance." The guard saluted, started to leave, stopped. "Fight well, die well, or don't die at all. Same to you." Kael left. Malric stood his ground, watching Serathis with an expression that cycled between pride and grief, and something that looked like it might break him. "And me? You lead the ground forces. Hold the gates as long as possible. When they break, and they will break, fall back to the inner courtyard. Layer your defenses. Make them bleed for every inch. And you? I'll be where the shadows are thickest, where the wolves are most afraid. That's not a plan. It's the only one we have." They stared at each other. An entire conversation happening in the silence between them. All the things they'd never have time to say. All the futures that would never exist. Malric stepped closer. Close enough that she could count the individual scars on his face. Could see the exact color of his eyes. Brown, but with flecks of gold she'd never noticed before. "When this is over, it won't be. Not for me. You know that." He knew. She could see it in every line of his face, but he said it anyway. "When this is over, we'll rebuild. Create something better. An empire that doesn't grind people into nothing just because they're different. A world where someone like you gets to live. That's a beautiful dream. It could be real. Only if you win. And you won't. Not the way you're thinking. Then how? By changing what winning means, by making sure my death accomplishes something your survival never could." Before he could respond, before he could argue or plead or command her to reconsider, she kissed him. Hard, desperate, final, pouring every unsaid word into the contact, every moment they'd never have, every future that was dying before it could be born. Then she pulled away, walked past him, down the corridor, toward the sounds of war drums in the distance and the army that was coming to destroy everything she'd become. Behind her she heard Malric's voice, broken, raw. Serathis. Her name. Just her name. She didn't look back. Looking back meant acknowledging what she was leaving behind. And she couldn't afford that. Couldn't afford to doubt or hesitate or let love override the necessity of what came next. The void power burned inside her like a star going supernova. 18 hours. Maybe less now after the initial surge. 18 hours to end a war that had been building for 1,000 years. 18 hours to prove that the void touched weren't victims or monsters or mistakes of nature. 18 hours to reshape the world before it consumed her completely. Serathis climbed to the highest tower of the keep. The wind whipped her hair around her face. The shadows coiled around her like armor, like living extensions of her will. She stood at the precipice and looked out at the army approaching. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. Every wolf who'd ever feared what she represented. Every alpha who believed the old ways were the only ways. Every pack that thought power came only from tooth and claw. They looked like inevitability. They looked like the end of everything. And Sarathus smiled, because they thought this was about survival, about her trying to stay alive, about fear. But they were wrong. This was about defiance, about showing them that some things refuse to die quietly, that some forces, once awakened, can't be sealed away again, no matter how hard you try. The wolves reached the outer walls. The siege began. Arrows flew. Steel rang against steel. The sounds of war rose like a symphony of violence. And standing alone at the top of the tower, wreathed in shadows that moved like living darkness, Serathis Vale prepared to become exactly what they feared most. Not a victim, not a monster, but a reckoning. The void power surged inside her, eager, hungry, ready to show them all what dissolution looked like when it decided to fight back. The drums of war pounded like a heartbeat. The shadows answered, and everything was about to change. The first wave hit the outer walls like a tsunami of fur and fury. Sarathus watched from the tower as thousands of wolves crashed against stone that had stood for 3 centuries. She could hear the impact from here. The roar of voices raised in battle cry, the screams of those who fell to arrows, the sound of claws scraping against granite as they tried to climb, to breach, to destroy. The void power pulsed inside her, impatient, hungry. Not yet. She whispered it to the shadows, to herself, to whatever was consuming her from the inside. Let them commit. Let them think they're winning. Because here's what she'd learned about power in the weeks since she'd arrived at this cursed place. The strongest moves aren't the fastest. They're the ones your opponent doesn't see coming, the ones that wait until commitment becomes trap. The outer wall held for 11 minutes. Then it didn't. The gates exploded inward, not from battering rams, from raw force. A dozen alphas hitting the same point simultaneously, their combined strength shattering reinforced oak and iron like kindling. The wolves poured through. Malric's forces met them in the courtyard, steel against claw, human strategy against animal fury. The clash was brutal, immediate. Men died. Wolves died. The stones ran red within seconds. Serathis watched it all from above, cataloging, learning, understanding the flow of battle the way she'd learned to understand the flow of shadows. The void showed her patterns, weak points, places where the enemy concentrated, places where they spread thin. It was teaching her, preparing her, or consuming her faster. Hard to tell the difference. She closed her eyes, reached deep into the well of power burning through her cells, felt it respond, eager, ready, and she let it loose. The shadows erupted from her like a tidal wave made of pure darkness. They cascaded down the tower, across the courtyard, into the mass of fighting bodies below. But they didn't consume everything. That was the trick, the control she'd been practicing in the second since drinking Vrasha's poison. The shadows moved like surgical instruments, precise, targeted. They wrapped around wolves, only wolves, and pulled them down. Not killing, not yet, just stopping. Immobilizing hundreds of them in an instant, holding them frozen mid-strike, mid-leap, mid-kill. The battlefield went silent. Every eye turned upward, toward the tower, toward her. Sarathus stepped off the edge. She didn't fall. The shadows caught her, carried her down like she weighed nothing at all, like gravity was a suggestion she could ignore. She landed in the center of the courtyard, in the space between armies, between the Empire and those who wanted to destroy it. The wolves who weren't frozen stared at her, at the darkness coiled around her like living armor, At the power radiating from her in waves they could feel even if they couldn't see it. And she saw it happen. Saw the moment fear replaced fury in their eyes. One of them shifted. A massive alpha, gray-furred and scarred. Old enough to know better, young enough to think courage could overcome terror. He charged. Serathis raised her hand. The shadows caught him mid-leap, held him suspended. Not gently. She walked toward him, slow, deliberate. Let everyone see. Let everyone understand what was about to happen. You came here to destroy me, to finish what your ancestors started, to wipe out the void touched once and for all. Her voice carried across the courtyard, across the broken gates, to every wolf who could hear. But you made a mistake. You thought I was weak, defenseless, something to be hunted. She stopped in front of the suspended alpha, met his eyes. I'm not. The shadows tightened. The alpha screamed. Sarathus reached inside him with the void, found his wolf, the beast that made him strong, that gave him purpose, that defined his entire existence. And she began to pull. It was harder than with Draven. This one fought, resisted. His will was stronger, his connection deeper. But will doesn't matter against entropy. Nothing does. Everything breaks down eventually. Everything returns to the void. She pulled harder. The wolf came free. The alpha's scream cut off abruptly. He collapsed when the shadows released him, curled into a ball, sobbing, broken. Human in a way he'd never been before and never wanted to be. Wolfless. Like her. Sarathus turned to face the army. This is what I can do. This is what every single one of you risks by being here. I can take what makes you whole, what gives you identity, what separates you from the humans you despise. She gestured to the broken alpha at her feet. Is that what you came for? To risk becoming this? Silence. Absolute. Even the wounded had stopped screaming. Then, from the back of the wolf army, a voice. You're a monster. Female. Young. Terrified but defiant. Maybe. Serathis didn't deny it. But I'm a monster you created. Every rejection, every humiliation, every moment I was told I was nothing, every year I spent believing I was broken. That made this. She spread her arms, let them see the shadows writhing around her. So if I'm a monster, what does that make you? A different voice. Older, male, carrying authority. We're survivors. We did what we had to do to protect our people, to ensure the strong survived and the weak didn't drag us down. And how did that work out? Serathis' voice carried an edge now. You built an empire on strength, on dominance, on the idea that power justifies everything. And what did it give you? Endless war, constant challenges, a king with a curse eating him alive, territories that hate each other, an empire held together by fear. She took a step toward them. I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here to show you that your way failed, that strength without balance becomes tyranny, that creation without dissolution becomes stagnation. The wolves were listening now, not agreeing, but listening, because fear is a teacher, and she'd just taught them to be very afraid. Your ancestors killed mine because they were scared, because they couldn't control us, couldn't understand us, so they eliminated us rather than learn to coexist. Sarathis' voice dropped lower. And you were going to do the same thing. Come here. Kill me. Wipe out the void touched again. Repeat history because you're too afraid to change it. She paused. Let the words sink in. But I'm giving you a different choice. Leave. Now. Go back to your territories, your packs, your lives, and never come back. What if we refuse? The older male voice again. Challenging. Then I take your wolves, all of them, every single one, and you spend the rest of your lives as what you feared most. She wasn't bluffing. They could hear it in her voice, see it in the way the shadows pulsed with each word. Nothing. The word fell like a stone. For a long moment, nobody moved. The army of wolves stood frozen. Not by shadows this time, by decision, by the calculation of whether dying with their wolves was better than living without them. Then, slowly, the wolves began to retreat. Not running, not fleeing, just backing away. Toward the broken gates. Toward escape. One by one, dozen by dozen, 100 by 100, the army dissolved. Melted away like snow under sun. Within minutes, the courtyard was empty except for Malric's forces. The frozen wolves Serathis still held, and the broken alpha sobbing at her feet. She released the shadows, holding the others. They fell, scrambled to their feet, ran, following their army, following survival instinct, following the realization that some battles can't be won through strength alone. When the last one disappeared through the gates, Sarathus let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The void power surged inside her, angry, frustrated. It had wanted more, wanted consumption, wanted to reduce them all to ash and shadow, but she'd held it back. That control cost her. She felt it immediately. The burning intensified, spread. The shadows clinging to her skin began to smoke. She could smell her own flesh starting to char from the inside out. 18 hours, Vrash had said. Sarathus suspected she had less than 6 now. The cost of mercy is always high. The void doesn't understand restraint, doesn't comprehend the difference between justice and genocide. It only understands endings, completions, the return of all things to silence. And by holding it back, by refusing to let it consume everything it touched, she'd turned its hunger inward. It was eating her faster now. Malric was there suddenly, arms around her, holding her up when her legs gave out. You did it. They're gone. You won. His voice carried relief, pride, joy. She wished she could feel any of those things. No, I bought time. That's all. They'll come back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not for years, but eventually they'll come back. Because fear doesn't change beliefs, it just postpones them. Then we'll be ready. Will you? She looked up at him. Because I won't be here. The truth of it sat between them. Heavy, absolute. Malric's expression crumbled. How long? Hours. The void is burning through me faster now. Every time I use it, every time I hold it back, it consumes more. Then we get Vrash, find a way to slow it, to stop it. There is no stopping it. You know that. This was always how it ended. She touched his face, felt the roughness of his beard, the warmth of living skin, things she'd never feel again after today. I don't accept that. Malric's voice was fierce, desperate. You don't have to accept it. But it's happening anyway. Serathis pulled away from him, stood on her own. Each movement hurt now. Each breath. She walked toward the broken alpha still curled on the ground, knelt beside him. What's your name? He looked up, eyes red, face wet with tears and snot and the devastation of loss. Why do you care? Because you're like me now, and I need you to understand something. She waited until he met her eyes. Being wolfless doesn't make you nothing. It makes you different. And different doesn't mean broken. It means you have to find new ways to be strong. I don't want new ways. I want my wolf back. I know. The understanding in her voice made him flinch. But you can't have it. So you have 2 choices. Spend the rest of your life mourning what you lost, or build something new from what remains. That's easy for you to say. You have power. I have hours. Maybe less. And I spent 23 years believing I was worthless because I didn't have what you just lost. Sarathus stood. So take it from someone who knows. Your worth isn't tied to what makes you special. It's tied to what you do with what you have. Even when what you have is nothing. She left him there, walked back toward the keep. Malric followed. So did Kael, materializing from wherever she'd been during the battle. The guard's armor was dented, blood on her sword. But she was alive. The 3 of them climbed the steps together, through corridors that felt different now, quieter, like the keep itself was holding its breath. They reached Sarathus's room, the one with barred windows, the one that had been her cage and her sanctuary. She walked to the window, looked out at the city below, at the capital that had almost burned today, at the empire that had almost fallen. I need to tell you what happens next. Her voice was steady, calm. The voice of someone who'd made peace with impossible things. When I die, and I will die, the void power will be released. It'll try to find another host, another void touch to bond with. There aren't any others, you said so yourself, that we know of. But power like this doesn't just disappear. It waits, hibernates, sometimes for centuries. So what do we do? Serathis turned to face them. You make sure the next person who manifests doesn't have to face what I faced. You change the laws, the traditions, the entire structure of how this empire views power. That's asking a lot. I know. But you asked me once what I wanted. What would be enough? She looked at Malric. This is it. Change everything. Build something better. Make sure my death means something more than just revenge or fear. The king's jaw tightened. I will. I swear it. But not because you're dying. Because you're right. The Empire needs to change. And it will. Good. Serathis felt the void surge again. Stronger this time. Harder to contain. She had less time than she thought. I need you both to leave now. No. Malric's voice was flat. Absolute. You don't get to die alone. Yes. I do. Because what comes next isn't pretty. And I won't have your last memory of me be... She stopped. Reconsidered. Please, give me this. Let me do this one thing with dignity. Kael bowed. Deep, respectful. It's been an honor. The guard left. Malric didn't move. I'm not leaving. You are. Because you're a king, and kings don't get to indulge in personal grief when their empire needs them. There are wounded to tend, defenses to rebuild, territory leaders to reassure. He knew she was right. She could see it in his face. But knowing didn't make it easier. I love you. The words came out raw, unpolished, the first time he'd said them out loud. I know. Sarathus smiled, sad, genuine, and that's going to have to be enough. She kissed him one last time, gentle, brief, a goodbye compressed into a moment. Then she pushed him toward the door. Go. Be the king they need you to be. What about what I need? You need to survive me. To build the world I won't get to see. That's what I need from you. Malric stood in the doorway, looking back at her, memorizing her face. I'll see you again. Somehow. Maybe. In whatever comes after. She didn't believe it, didn't think there was an after for people like her, but the lie was kindness. He left. The door closed. And Serathis was alone. She sat on the bed, the same bed she'd sat on 3 weeks ago when this all started, when she'd been nothing, powerless, broken. The void power pulsed inside her, burning, consuming, turning her cells into shadow one by one. It hurt beyond description, but she didn't scream, didn't cry out, just sat there and let it happen. Let herself be unmade with the same stoic silence she'd practiced for 23 years. Because here's what she understood now, in these final moments. Strength isn't about enduring pain without feeling it. It's about feeling it completely and choosing to face it anyway. It's about knowing you're breaking and refusing to let that breaking define you. The shadows began to pour from her skin, thicker now, darker, no longer under her control. The void was claiming what was left, taking back its power, reclaiming what she'd borrowed. Her vision started to fade, the edges of the room going dark. She thought about her parents, dead before she could remember them, about Draven, broken and wolfless, somewhere in exile, about Malric, rebuilding an empire on the foundation of her sacrifice, about all the void-touched who'd been killed, erased, forgotten. And she thought about the next one, the next person who'd manifest this power, who'd wake up one day feeling shadows respond to their touch, who'd be terrified and alone and convinced they were broken. She hoped Malric kept his promise, hoped the empire would be different for them, hoped her death bought something more than fear. The darkness closed in completely. Serathis Veil took her last breath, and the void took the rest. The shadows exploded outward in a wave that shattered the windows, that cracked the stone walls, that poured out into the night sky like smoke from a funeral pyre. They rose, higher, higher, until they touched the clouds, and then they scattered, dissolving, returning to whatever place shadows lived when they weren't being controlled, when they weren't being shaped by will and desperation and the stubborn refusal to disappear quietly. In the courtyard below, Malric felt it happen, felt the moment she stopped existing, felt the void power release in a wave that washed over the entire capital. He dropped to his knees. Didn't care who saw, didn't care about appearances or protocol or anything except the fact that the woman who'd saved his life, saved his empire, saved him from himself, was gone. Kael stood beside him, silent, a witness to grief that had no words. The capital was quiet. The wolves had fled. The battle was over. The empire had survived. But the cost was etched into every stone, every broken body, every life that had ended today. and into one king who'd learned too late that power without someone to share it with was just another kind of prison. 3 days later, Malric stood before an assembly of territory leaders. They'd come expecting recriminations, punishment for those who'd supported the wolf army, for those who'd questioned his authority. Instead, he gave them change. The old laws are dead, the ones that said worth comes from strength, that said the wolfless are worthless, that said difference is disease. His voice carried through the great hall, the same hall where Serathis had danced, had awakened, had shown them all what power really looked like. From this day forward, the empire is for everyone, wolf and wolfless, strong and weak, traditional and different. We survive together or we fall apart. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This is madness, someone said. You're destroying everything our ancestors built. Good. Our ancestors were wrong. They built an empire on fear and dominance, and it nearly destroyed us all. Time to try something different? And if we refuse, then you're free to leave. Take your territory, your people, your traditions, and see how long you last on your own. Malric's eyes were hard. But if you stay, you follow the new laws. You protect the powerless. You value adaptability as much as strength. You build instead of destroy. It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. Some left, walked out, took their loyalty and their territories and their old ways with them. But most stayed, because they'd seen what happened when the old ways were challenged. They'd seen a wolfless girl with void power stand against an army and make them blink. They'd learned that strength alone wasn't enough anymore. Within months, the first changes took effect. Wolfless individuals were granted legal protections, rights, opportunities beyond servitude and exile. The old purge records were opened, made public. Every void touched who'd been killed was named, remembered, honored. Monuments were built, not to glorify, but to acknowledge, to say, this happened, we did this, we were wrong. And in the keep, in the highest tower, a single room was preserved exactly as it had been. Bars on the windows, simple bed, the basin for washing, the room where Serathis Vale had lived for 3 weeks, where she'd transformed from nothing into everything. It became a shrine, not officially, the king never declared it one. But people came anyway. Wolfless individuals who needed to see that someone like them had mattered, had changed the world, had proven that worth wasn't tied to the beast inside you. They left flowers, tokens, letters addressed to someone who couldn't read them, but whose legacy gave them hope anyway. Malric visited once, stood in the doorway, looked at the bed where she'd slept, the window where she'd watched the city, the floor where she'd made the choice that saved them all. He didn't go inside. Couldn't. Because going inside meant acknowledging she was really gone, that this empty room was all that remained, and he wasn't ready for that. Might never be ready for that. So he stood in the doorway and spoke to the silence. I kept my promise, changed everything, built something better, something you'd be proud of. The shadows in the corners didn't answer, just shadows now, normal, powerless. I miss you, every day. And I hate that you had to die for this. Hate that the price of change was your life. He paused. But I understand why you did it, why you drank that poison, why you faced them all. Because some things are worth dying for, and some people are built to stand when everyone else runs. You were one of them. He bowed. Deep. The kind of bow reserved for sovereigns. Then he left, went back to the work of rebuilding, of changing, of creating the empire she'd died to make possible. And he never visited the room again, because forward was the only direction that honored her sacrifice. Years passed. The empire changed, slowly, imperfectly, but changed. The territories that had left came back, one by one, because isolation was harder than adaptation, because strength without unity was just another kind of weakness. The wolf packs learned to coexist with the wolfless. Not easily, not without conflict, but they learned. And every generation the story was told, about the girl who had nothing, who was told she was broken, who survived everything designed to destroy her, and who, when given power that could reshape the world, chose to save it instead. The story changed with each telling, embellished, mythologized, turned into legend. Some versions made her a hero, others a martyr, some a monster who sacrificed herself to atone for her nature. But all of them agreed on one thing. Serathis Vale had mattered. And in a world that had spent her entire life telling her she didn't, that was victory enough. Decades later, in a small village on the northern border, a child was born. Healthy, strong, perfectly normal. Except when she cried, the shadows in the room grew darker. When she laughed, they danced. And when she reached for her mother, they reached back. The midwife saw it, recognized it from the old stories, from the histories that had been suppressed for so long and were only now being recovered. "She's void-touched." The words came out reverent, awed. The mother pulled her daughter close, protective, fierce. "Will they come for her?" "No. The laws have changed. She's protected now, valued." The midwife smiled. "She'll have a different life than the last one, a better one, because someone made sure of it." The child opened her eyes, dark, deep, old beyond her moments. And for just an instant, the shadows in the room formed a shape, a woman, tall, thin, wrapped in darkness like a cloak. She stood over the cradle, looking down at the infant with an expression that might have been pride, or recognition, or the acknowledgement that passed between people who carried the same burden. Then she faded, returned to whatever place void-touched went when they burned through their power and had nothing left but legacy. The mother didn't see her. The midwife did. And she understood. Serathis Vale hadn't disappeared, hadn't been erased. She'd become what all legends become, a story, a warning, a promise, that no matter how hard the world tries to destroy what it doesn't understand, some forces refuse to stay buried. Some powers wait, hibernate, return. And some people, no matter how broken the world tells them they are, find ways to matter that outlast their own lives. The child in the cradle would grow up in a world Sarathus never got to see, a world where void-touched weren't hunted, where difference wasn't disease, where worth wasn't measured by the beast inside you. She'd never know the woman who died to make that world possible, but she'd lived the life that death had purchased. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that's what legacy really meant, not being remembered, but making the world better for those who came after, even if they never knew your name. King Malric Veyron died in his sleep at the age of 73. They found him in his chambers, peaceful. No signs of struggle. The curse that had plagued him for decades was long gone, healed by the woman who'd taken it into herself and burned it away. His last words, spoken to Kael, who'd remained his most trusted advisor until the end, were simple. "Tell her I kept my promise." Kael nodded, though she knew Serathis couldn't hear, knew the void had claimed her completely. But she spoke the words anyway, to the shadows in the corner, to the memory, to the idea that maybe, somewhere, somehow, the woman who'd changed everything was still listening. He kept his promise, changed the world, made it better. The shadows didn't answer. They never did. But Kael thought they grew a little softer, a little warmer, like approval, like recognition, like a woman who'd spent her life being nothing, finally understanding that she'd become everything. The empire Serathis Vale had saved continued, evolved, grew beyond the borders the wolves had established, became something new, not perfect, never perfect, but better. And in the highest tower of the keep, in a room preserved exactly as it had been decades ago, the flowers kept appearing, left by people who understood what it meant to be different, to be broken, to be told you were nothing and choose to prove them wrong, left by the next generation of void-touched who grew up free because one woman had refused to die quietly, left by anyone who understood that true power isn't about domination, it's about sacrifice, about standing when everyone else runs, about burning yourself to ash so others can walk through the light. Serathis Vale had done all of that. And though her body was gone, though the void had consumed her completely, though nothing remained but stories and shadows in a room nobody dared disturb, she had won, not by surviving, but by mattering. And in the end, mattering is the only victory that counts. The crown does not create power, it reveals it. And when the world pushes someone to the edge, it doesn't decide whether they fall. It decides what they become when they rise. Serathis Vale did not seek revenge. She became the consequence of it, and the world would never be the same.